the first reaction among many was to point towards Al-Qaeda or AQ-inspired terrorism. We now know fairly certain that this perpetrator in Oslo was affiliated to right-wing groups, and some are now reporting that he may also have held anti-Muslim views. Now, on one level, this is surprising because the main form of violence that we've seen in Europe has been from AQ-inspired groups. But on the other, this perhaps isn't so surprising when we consider the way in which support for right-wing movements and ideas across Europe has been moving upwards.
What do these groups want, besides to cause as much mayhem and kill as many people as possible? Somebody like a right-wing extremist in Norway, what's their agenda?
Well, if it turns out that this individual is affiliated to a right-wing group, those on the ultra-violent, extra-parliamentary fringe, when we look at cases in the past, have often wanted to trigger some kind of conflict between members of different groups. So we had a similar case in Britain where an activist was arrested before he had a chance to carry out those attacks, and his goal was to try and trigger what he called a race war. Now, it may just simply be the case that he wanted to cause absolute destruction and the death of young Norwegians. I mean, we just don't know at this point. But often, when you look back through cases in the past, you think about Timothy McVeigh in Oklahoma, you think about David Copeland in London, there's often, in their motivations, has been an attempt to try and push society towards some kind of clash of civilizations.
You raise McVeigh, and to some extent, my next question was going to be, are you surprised at this guy's potentially alleged ability to build a bomb of such devastating potential, 6 tons of fertilizer perhaps going into the manufacture? But McVeigh showed us, of course, didn't he, in Oklahoma City, that these people are capable of constructing very large, powerful ordnance.
Well, absolutely. I mean, before 9/11, the most destructive act of terrorism on American soil, at least in the post-war period, was by Timothy McVeigh. So there's no question that groups on the right have the potential to carry out just as much destruction as AQ-inspired groups. What I think is slightly different, and again, the evidence is much thinner on the ground in terms of the right wing, but what I think is different is that right-wing activists tend to work in smaller cells and tend to work more in isolation, perhaps, than those that work within AQ-inspired groups that tend to be relatively well networked across the continent and relatively well networked to groups outside of Europe. Now, that seems to be fitting what's been going on in Oslo.
Okay, Dr. Goodwin, so you're a European leader or a commissioner today, and you now see these facts. It's very difficult, and perhaps more difficult, to prevent your own people from the right wing or left wing from an external force as Al-Qaeda, or is it the same, do you think?
Well, I think what's going to be interesting over the next few days and weeks will be the first comments that come out of Oslo in terms of the motivations that pushed this individual into these acts, and I suspect the police will be quite careful as to how they release those. But, will it be the case that this was motivated by concern over growing Islam in European societies? Is this a case that the activist is motivated more by what perhaps he sees as the ineffective response from mainstream parties? Perhaps he was motivated by conspiracy theories, around the role of elite groups in society. We've yet to find this out. But what I think is clear when we look across Europe over the last 10 to 20 years is a growing public concern over immigration, rising diversity, and increasingly the perceived role of Islam in European society. Now, if it turns out that those are the concerns that were driving this activist, then we need to return to those debates about how we can go about responding to public anxiety over these issues. Now, clearly, we're never going to satisfy those on the absolute fringes of society who are prepared to carry out violence in this way. But I think it may be the case that we need to revisit that discussion around how can we respond to anxiety over minority groups, over rising diversity across Europe.